discuss all the latest developments with three members of Parliament from the foyer of the Commons tonight. We're joined by Marco Mendicino, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and the former Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Michael Cooper is the Justice Critic for the Official Opposition and a member of the Justice Committee of the House of Commons, and Daniel Blakey is the Treasury Board Critic for the NDP. It's good to see you all, gentlemen.
Hi, Peter.
Mr. Cooper, let me start with you. As a member of the Justice Committee, we got some news from the Justice Committee this afternoon that members have decided to call Gerald Butts, who asked to be invited earlier today. He'll be at the committee next Wednesday, and you're also going to recall the Privy Council Clerk Michael Wernick and the Deputy Minister of Justice Nathalie Drouin. But let me start with Jerry Butts. What do you want to know from Jerry Butts? Why is he coming to the committee?
Well, he has a lot to answer for. This is an individual who, based on the evidence of Jody Wilson-Raybould, whose testimony I fully believe demonstrates that he acted at the very least completely inappropriately and potentially illegally. And what I would like to see is that Mr. Butts and the Clerk of the Privy Council, Mr. Wernick, testify under oath. Mr. Wernick's testimony from last week was totally demolished by Jody Wilson-Raybould. If her testimony is true, and I believe it to be so, then Mr. Wernick is a liar. These two individuals need to come before us, but they should do so under oath with the possibility that they could be charged with perjury if they don't tell the full truth.
Okay, so that becomes a decision at the time, I gather, by committee members, or is that by the chair, by the clerk? Who decides that?
Well, all I can say is Liberal MPs have shown very little interest in making that happen.
Okay, Mr. Mendicino, there's a damaging narrative out there from Jody Wilson-Raybould about political interference in her affairs, right up to the Prime Minister, and including Mr. Butts, who she says also pressured her to intervene in the SNC Lavalin prosecution. When he resigned last week, he said he did nothing wrong. How important is it for Canadians to hear what he has to say at the Justice Committee next week?
Well, it's good to hear that the committee has taken a decision to hear from Mr. Butts, and having read his written statement in the request, he said that he believes, having heard Ms. Wilson-Raybould's testimony, that he has some additional information to offer, which will be helpful. And I think this is a proof, yet another concrete example of the committee doing its work. So unlike my opposition colleagues, I actually think that the process is unfolding, and it's a demonstration that the administration of justice and the legislative process and the committee's work are indeed intact.
Okay, and Mr. Blakey, what's your view of all this?
Well, I mean, I think it's good that Mr. Butts is going to be testifying at committee. Of course, there are other players that we would like to see testifying at committee, including Katie Telford, for instance, and some of those people who were part of that concerted pressure campaign on the former Attorney General to reverse her decision. And the thing that would help this along, in our view, both in terms of having the appropriate scope for the inquiry and also just feeling like the quality of the investigation isn't at the mercy of a Liberal majority on a committee, would be to have a full public inquiry. And so that's why we've been calling for that. It's something that ought to happen, and this whole game of not being able to get straight answers on who's going to be testifying and having to rely on people who very obviously have an interest in what gets told and what doesn't is not the appropriate way to investigate charges that are this serious in nature.
Mr. Cooper, I think you also had hoped to put a motion to the committee today to have the Prime Minister show up to testify as well. Have I got that right? And what happened there?
Well, we'd like to have the Prime Minister testify. He needs to testify. It's clear, based upon the evidence, that he was up to his eyeballs in political interference and directing his officials to obstruct justice. So the Prime Minister does need to testify. We also do
What happened to your motion? Did you get to move it?
Well, no, I can't speak. It was an in-camera meeting. But I can say that in terms of...
But I can ask you this. Did the committee agree to hear from the Prime Minister?
No. Well, look, we dealt with a motion respecting Mr. Butts.
Okay.
And as far as Ms. Wilson-Raybould goes, we need to hear from her as well. I mean, we heard from her yesterday, yes, but Ms. Wilson-Raybould has stated that there are certain things that she thinks are relevant to getting to the truth of the matter that she can't speak about because the Prime Minister is silencing her. Those are the discussions and communications that took place after he fired her as Attorney General, but while she was in Cabinet. We need to hear from her on those matters before the committee, but before we do that, the Prime Minister needs to lift all solicitor-client privilege and Cabinet confidentiality, something he continues to refuse to do.
Okay, Mr. Mendicino, let me take up with you, if I can, where this the sort of narrative is going here. And what we're actually seeing is we have Jody Wilson-Raybould's testimony, and we also have what we're hearing from the government's defense here has been that they were pushing hard to protect jobs at SNC Lavalin, and yet she told of pressure from Ben Chin, the Chief of Staff to the Finance Minister, telling her there was a Quebec election coming as SNC Lavalin was musing about leaving Quebec, and we can't have that, he allegedly told her. The Prime Minister, according to Jody Wilson-Raybould, invoked concerns about the impact on the provincial election in Quebec and on his standing as the MP from Papineau, Quebec. Isn't that more than a conversation about protecting jobs unless we're talking about political jobs?
Well, the Prime Minister disagreed with the characterizations of Ms. Wilson-Raybould's interactions with his staff, but at the same time, he acknowledges, as she did, that the request for the meeting between her and him on September 17th was appropriate, it was lawful, and she acknowledged as well that he was perfectly within his purview to raise the concerns around jobs. And why? Because obviously we would want to avoid any negative impact on innocent third parties. Now that is
he raised concerns about the outcome of the Quebec election.
That is a perfectly legitimate consideration for him to have put forward. In other words, the consideration around jobs.
And about the Quebec election as well?
And obviously I heard the clerk to clarify that the references to the jobs and the economy were legitimate. She agreed with that. Why? Because it matters to him both as Prime Minister as well as being the Member of Parliament for a Quebec riding in Papineau.
Yeah, but the concern she expressed repeatedly about people interfering was that in many of these interventions, they tied political considerations to their objections and not just economic considerations.
Well, the Prime Minister disagrees with that characterization, and obviously Ms. Wilson-Raybould has her perspective, and we will continue to hear from witnesses at committee. And again, unlike my opposition colleagues who've expressed some concerns around the work of the committee, if you actually take a look at what's going on there, we are hearing from witnesses. My colleagues are able to ask questions. All parties are able to ask questions. They are getting answers. That is a product of the government getting out of the way and providing a waiver of privilege. And this is a hallmark that our system is functioning properly.
Mr. Blakey, let me have you weigh in here on this, these two competing narratives. It's all about jobs, and in her case, it's interference that went too far and was political in nature.
Well, first of all, it was disconcerting to hear that, according to Ms. Wilson-Raybould, that the Prime Minister and others were raising obviously political considerations as reasons to reverse her decision. But on the matter of jobs, I would say this. We were in the Government Operations Committee yesterday, and we were talking about the government's integrity policy. And that's the policy that would require, if there was a conviction, that there would be a 10-year suspension on government contracts. In the course of that discussion, so first of all, the fact that the government is looking at changing that policy, I think, is an admission that the appropriate tool in order to save those jobs was never inappropriately pressuring the Attorney General to abandon criminal charges. There was a discussion to be had about their policy.
It makes one wonder, your point, it makes one wonder if they're revisiting their integrity policy, which would have given which would have been another opportunity for SNC Lavalin to get off the bad books and get back into government bidding. It makes you wonder why we had this whole political pressure thing on Jody Wilson.
Indeed, and it makes it seem like they are pulling out all the stops to cover all the angles for all the ways that SNC Lavalin might get into some trouble. And when the Minister of Public Services and Procurement was asked repeatedly yesterday at committee if she would just say that she thought bribery of public officials was a serious offense requiring serious punishment, she declined to answer, and in fact at one point said that the government has no position on any hierarchy of offenses. And it just goes to show how deeply rooted the desire to protect SNC Lavalin is in this government.
Okay, quick, let's finish.
Causing them to cross lines they shouldn't cross.
Let's finish on this. Mr. Cooper, your leader's asking for the Prime Minister to resign. He's also calling for an RCMP investigation, has written to the RCMP calling for them to get involved in this matter.
Yeah.
Are we there yet, as long as the committee continues to hear from the people so far you seem to want to hear from?
Well, the evidence before us is that we have a Prime Minister and his top officials who repeatedly attempted to obstruct justice, who repeatedly put partisan political considerations ahead of the rule of law, and we have a Prime Minister who has repeatedly lied about his involvement in this matter. He has broken the public trust, and he needs to go, and we need to get the RCMP in there to investigate if they aren't already doing so, because the evidence by Ms. Wilson-Raybould indicates that at the very least the Prime Minister and his top officials acted completely inappropriately, but they may very well have obstructed justice.
Mr. Mendicino, let me hear from you on that.
Well, look, it's not for parliamentarians to comment on whether or not to initiate criminal investigations. Those decisions will be taken by the RCMP. They're an independent branch of government. And frankly, making comments at the urging on the basis of what we've heard thus far from an evidentiary point of view is both premature and inappropriate. And I think that there's a consistency in pattern here. You know, on the one hand, my opposition colleagues say they want to hear from the Prime Minister, and in the same breath, virtually, they've already come to very hard and fast conclusions about what his evidence will be and what his motivations are, and that is not the way that you should be approaching this exercise.
Mr. Blakey, too early for...
We should be letting the committee do its work.
Too early for a police investigation here, or to demand one?
Well, I mean, it's certainly anybody can write to the RCMP at any time and request that they look into something. It's up to the RCMP to decide whether or not they believe there's sufficient evidence to warrant an investigation. So I'm not going to be telling the RCMP how to do their job. They are aware, I'm sure, of the testimony, and it will be up to them to make that decision. What we are calling for is a public inquiry, because we think there's a lot more to get to the bottom of, and we're reserving judgment on some of these matters until we've heard more. We're not confident that we're going to hear everything we need to hear through the Justice Committee. We are hearing some, but a full public inquiry with a much broader scope than the scope that the Justice Committee has chosen for itself would be the most appropriate way to get to the very bottom of what's been going on.
All right. Well, in the short term, more Justice Committee hearings next week. You can follow it all here on CPAC. Thank you all for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.